Welcome, everyone. This is our bi-monthly conversation, Global Peoria. Tonight, we're going to talk to Professor John Nielsen, who is a Middle East expert, a professor of history at Bradley University. Shelley Epstein, our resident journalist, will grill him with some good questions. And at the end, I encourage you to ask your own questions. If you would please write them in the chat. Shelley will pick from them as time permits. So on behalf of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council, welcome Professor Nielsen, and take it away, Shelley.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome all. Glad you're all here. Tonight we have, as Angela said, John Nielsen, professor of history. He's been at Bradley 9 years or there. So his specialty, he teaches pre-Islamic and modern Middle East, which is appropriate for our discussion. And he's got a PhD and a master's from the great University of Chicago in Hyde Park, Illinois. Great place to be. Familiar with Hyde Park very well. And so the subject today is the Pope went to Iraq earlier this week for 4 days. The first Pope ever to go there. Apparently it's a historic land for all the major religions because Abraham hails from there. And so I guess the first question I have for you, John, is what does this trip mean for the Pope and the Papacy?
I should say I really enjoyed the coverage of the trip. For me, it was fascinating. I think for the Papacy, it really emblemizes his desire to reach out to Christian communities on the periphery and expand kind of the geographic definition, I think in the Western sense, of what is and where is historically Christian. So his reaching out to the Christian communities, those ancient Christian communities in Iraq, was fascinating and was really very beautiful, and you could see that in the responses from the communities.
And historically, can you put it in historical context?
Yeah, I mean, these are some of the oldest, Christian communities in the world. I mean, you have, for example, the Assyrian Christians and the Chaldean Christians. The Assyrian Christians are mostly centered around Mosul in northern Iraq. And so even that community, because Mosul is the site of where ancient Nineveh was in the Assyrian Empire, that community traces their historical Christianity and their monotheism, back to Jonah. The prophet Jonah is believed to be buried there at Nebi Yunus in Mosul. So, I mean, these communities, they see themselves as part of an ancient land, and they tie their identities into that ancient land. I don't know. There was, I think, a week or two ago, there was a lovely article in the New York Times about the tomb of Joshua in Baghdad, and again, it reflected the belief that these prophets in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam chose to be buried in Iraq, and there's that belief. So yeah, especially the Christian community, the Assyrian Christian community in northern Iraq, has a long presence there, going back to probably the Apostle Thomas.
And is there much of a Christian community left, or has it been hollowed out in the last 20 or 30 years?
It has been hollowed out significantly. I mean, back when Saddam Hussein, before the first Gulf War, the Christian population in Iraq was probably 1.5 million. And now, over the subsequent wars, it's been probably reduced to 500,000. So it has been significantly reduced. And historically, if you think back through the Ottoman Empire and even earlier, these communities were very isolated. Northern Iraq, especially the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, these were not places where imperial power, reached intensively. And so these communities were left alone. So you would have a Christian village and a Sunni village and a Yazidi village, all within, a short distance from each other, but they maintain their distinct identities.
And do you know the Christians who remain, are they Roman Catholic or Coptic or Orthodox? What is their?
They are by and large, they by and large are aligned with the Catholic Church. Historically, they were Nestorian, but over time they have aligned themselves. So they would be defined as Eastern Rite Catholic. So their mass, their liturgy is in Arabic, or in many cases Aramaic, actually. But theologically, they adhere to Catholic teaching and recognize the Pope as an authority, if not the authority.
So it is aligned with the Roman Catholics as opposed to the Russian Orthodox.
Right, as opposed to the Eastern Orthodox, exactly.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. So what does the trip mean for Iraq and its government and its attempted efforts at democracy?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because, again, we have to appreciate that Iraq is a new country, right? It is in many ways a made-up country going back to Sykes-Picot, right? These borders were essentially created by the British and the French for their own purposes, and not necessarily to reflect the populations and the identities, both ethnicities and sectarian identities and linguistic identities that occupy Iraq. So I think the Pope's going there, and I think what was especially kind of compelling about his visit is, yes, there were Shiite and Sunni leaders meeting with him, as well as Christian leaders, but also many leaders from the other religious minorities in Iraq, like the Yazidis and like the Mandeans, which are, again, pre-Islamic religious traditions that harken back to antiquity. So I think the Pope going there was in part an attempt to remind the current Iraqi government that these Christians are part of this Iraqi state, and they had flourished under ostensibly secular authoritarian rule in the form of Saddam Hussein, and they could continue to be useful to the state. And so I think when the Pope met with Imam al-Sistani and I'm blanking on the city, not Najaf.
The northern city, right?
Yeah, no, in the south. Sorry, in Karbala. He was making the appeal to the Shiite majority that you need to see this as part of the broader body of Iraq. And so I think that was especially one of the reasons that he also went to Ur, which is considered to be the home of Abraham, to kind of try to overcome those traditional sectarian divisions.
So the meeting with al-Sistani I was particularly interested in. What impact did that have? And was that considered a success? How was that looked at amongst other Iraqis?
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting to wonder about, because al-Sistani is a Shiite cleric, a Shiite imam, and so has tremendous influence with the majority of Iraqis who are Shiites. But we have to remember that ISIS in the north of Iraq was a Sunni phenomenon, and the Christians of the north around Mosul, they were displaced by the Sunni minority in northern Iraq. So the degree to which the Pope's appeal to al-Sistani will create a more viable environment in northern Iraq, which is predominantly Sunni, it's hard to know. But certainly al-Sistani has profound influence on the presidency and the parliament in Iraq. I mean, he has effectively, prompted Iraqi presidents to step down. So I think, on the broad national scale, the fact that the Pope and al-Sistani, who rarely meets with outsiders, sat down together, probably sent a real strong message to Iraqis.
It was a fascinating photograph.
Yes.
If any of you haven't seen it, there's these two 80-year-old fellows and one's all dressed in white and one's all dressed in black, and one has a long beard and one doesn't. And if you haven't seen that picture, the Times in one of their shots has a link with a bunch of pictures, but that was the most memorable, I'd say.
Yeah.
Along with the Pope speaking in front of destroyed churches,
yes.
So are the Christians, I mean, obviously religion has an enormous impact politically, and it's Sunni versus Shiite. And where do the Christians stand? Do they pick a side, or they're trying to stay out of the fire?
Well, I think by and large, they're trying to stay out of the fire. But again, historically, Christian minorities throughout the Middle East, I mean, if you look at Syria, if you look at Egypt, if you look at Iraq under Saddam Hussein, they always had an uncomfortable alliance with the military dictatorship, in part because that dictatorship, the Assad family in Syria, they're Shiites. The majority of Syrians are Sunnis. The Assad family finds these minorities useful in terms of holding power. Likewise, Saddam Hussein who was a Sunni. I don't know if you remember during the Gulf Wars, his minister of information, Tariq Aziz, who would always be giving the press conferences saying, if you foreign infidels invade, we Iraqis will defeat you. He was a Christian. So there were Christians that were well placed in the Saddam Hussein regime. Likewise, the Coptic Christians in Egypt have often, had an uncomfortable alliance with the military regime in Egypt, in part because it gave them a little bit of protection.
That brings me to the question of elsewhere in the Middle East, its neighbors, Iran, Egypt, maybe even Israel, but the other surrounding countries. What's been their reaction to this visit by the Pope?
That's really hard to say. I haven't really looked into that. I mean, certainly the Pope had expressed hope that especially his visit to Ur would also have a Jewish representative. There are still, I think, maybe a dozen Jews living in Iraq.
A dozen?
Yes.
That's kind of frightening.
Yeah, and when you think that before 1948, the rabbi of Baghdad was one of the leading Jewish authorities in the Middle East, and there was this flourishing Jewish community in Iraq, and especially in Baghdad. That is reflective of the realities of the 20th century after the formation of Israel. But I do wonder what the Pope's desired impact beyond Iraq was in terms of the broader Middle East.
Well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'll turn it back over to you.
I was going to say specifically, vis-a-vis Iran, and obviously the relationship between Iraq and Iran has not always been swimmingly. Is there a message there with the Pope meeting with the Ayatollah to
that's hard to say.
Do something politically there, drive a wedge or bring them?
Yeah, I mean, because al-Sistani is Iranian, he is Persian, but as the leading imam in Iraq, he has become a very vocal Iraqi nationalist, and so there is amongst most Iraqi Shiites who are Arabs, there is a distrust of Shiite Persian Iran, or at least a desire that Iran not have too much influence. And so whether or not the Pope is thinking in terms of those geopolitical questions is hard to discern. There's not a large Christian minority in Iran, and I think the Pope's major concern is the continued viability and even flourishing of those Christian communities in Iraq. So I'm not sure if the Pope was trying to think in terms of how would my visit impact Iran. But I will conclude by saying, but I don't know.
Well, he talked a lot about, in this trip, what I've read, and I'm sure he talked a lot about peace.
Yes.
And certainly bringing religions together for peaceful purposes as opposed to conflict. And certainly doing that, sending that message, doesn't make a difference whether you're Christian or Muslim or Jew. That's a universal. There's a universality to that.
Yeah.
Be successful. I would urge everyone, remind everyone that if you have questions, please send them in on chat, and we will get to them fairly soon. So if you have questions for Dr. Nielsen or Angela or I don't know anything, but they do. We can forward them. One thing I read, and this was interesting, that the Pope was criticized for taking the trip during the pandemic. And I guess I'm wondering, I won't say criticized, he was asked about it by those pesky reporters on his plane. So I guess I'm wondering, what your take on that was, and was that a real issue?
I mean, I think it certainly was a real issue, but I think this is a trip that the Pope has longed to make for a long time, and he is not a young man. And so I think he was taking a very missional point of view in his decision to press ahead with this trip. I think he was setting aside his own safety because I think he believed in this trip. And so I think going in, I think the Pope's attitude was, even if he, contracts COVID and dies, God forbid, I think in his thinking, this was a trip that needed to be made sooner rather than later, especially in the aftermath of ISIS, because I think this was the arguably the earliest period in which the pandemic was sufficiently under control and ISIS was sufficiently diminished that this trip could be carried out. And I think the destruction, like you said, of all those Christian communities around Mosul by ISIS, I think they profoundly influenced the Pope's desire to go to Iraq.
And yet security was, as you would anticipate, intense. Yes. And, one thing I was impressed with, to show you what kind of fellow he is, politicians, Iraqi politicians, don't go some of the places he went without even more security, and not in, they fly instead of, and, he went wherever he wanted to go. And basically his pitch was, it's in God's hands. And yes, I think it says a lot about his faith, that he was willing to go where the people are. And so that's kind of Pope he is.
Yes, yes. And I think it's interesting too. I mean, he concluded his visit in Erbil at the stadium there, and he held a mass there. And Erbil is, of course, kind of the Kurdish capital in the north. And many of those displaced Christians from around Mosul, in that, as ISIS was expanding, it was the Kurds who protected them. It was the Kurds that offered them sanctuary. And so, the Kurds are Muslims, they're Sunnis, but they're not Arabs. And even going back, to the original establishment of Iraq, the Kurds have always desired their own independent state. And so I think for the Kurds, the fact that the Pope concluded his visit in Erbil was probably another expression of their aspirations too, if only indirectly.
If there are any good guys in that part of that neighborhood,
oh yeah,
certainly the Kurds, I would think, qualify.
Yeah,
they seem to be, and they've done some bad stuff too. But I'm reminded that the Pope and his entourage was fully vaccinated, but the Ayatollah was not. And Angela says that apparently they're just starting vaccinations in Iraq. So, that's what that's about. And what about what the Pope was saying to raise common cause against the resurgence of ISIS? Was he trying to put another brick in that wall? Those folks were not coming back?
I think he was, because I think, more broadly speaking, he was arguing against sectarian violence in Iraq written large. And this is why, I mean, he was always very intentional about not just bringing in Christians, but other religious minorities, of which, Iraq has many. The Yazidis especially suffered under ISIS too. And so, to remind Iraq that it is a multi-sectarian state, and that these communities deserve protection, just as the Christians deserve protection, I think was part of his overarching message.
Is there any place in the Middle East where the Pope would not be welcomed?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, that's very hard to say. I mean, I doubt he would be welcome in Saudi Arabia. But that's more for, the kind of the Wahhabi perspective of the Saudi royal family. I think for many countries, the visit from the Pope is still a very useful diplomatic expression. I don't know that Iran would be particularly eager to have the Pope visit, not for any specific religious reasons, but Syria would probably welcome a visit from the Pope, especially the Christian community there.
Lebanon?
Lebanon, of course. I mean, there's a large Catholic Christian, Maronite Christian population there.
Israel?
That would be very hard to say, but that would be problematic, because obviously the Palestinians, the Palestinian Christian population, would find that very compelling, and that might be a rallying point too. So that's very hard to say.
I wonder if a Pope has gone. I mean, Israel is so steeped in the three major religions.
Yeah.
If a Pope has gone there.
Off the top of my head, I do not know. That's a very good. Since 1948, I don't know if a Pope has visited Israel. I have to believe that one has, but someone should Google that really quickly. Angela.
Popes until fairly recently have not traveled very much.
No. I mean, it's really only with John Paul II that the Pope has become a global rock star.
Yes, very good. Angela, you have that answer? Are you checking that out?
I do. Pope John Paul II went to Israel in 2000, March 21, 2000. So right about this time.
Okay.
For a historic 5-day visit. It was the first time a Pope had visited Israel since its birth, and the Holy Lands for even longer than that. So 2000 was the first time.
Actually, no.
Oh, that's wrong.
Pope Paul VI visited in January 1964, and then after John Paul II, Benedict XVI visited in May 2009.
Yeah. Yep. The Pope Paul VI was for 11 hours.
11 hours.
For 11 hours. Probably said mass and got back on the plane. Yep.
Stopped in for a cup of coffee.
Good catch, Aria. Thank you.
So 64 was the first time.
Yep.
Well, that's not too awfully bad.
Yeah, that's actually
later. So
yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised that John Paul II went, but that Paul, yeah, that's actually really interesting.
So since your expertise is broadly in the Middle East, correct?
Correct.
What's next for the Middle East? which is both a broad and a loaded question, both.
That's a really good question, and it's really hard to answer that. Certainly, what has happened in Israel under the Likud government, and the willingness of Middle Eastern and Gulf states to begin establishing diplomatic and commercial ties with Israel has been fascinating. And it'll be very interesting to see what kind of ramifications that has.
So educate me. I think probably anyone who's listened to this knows I'm not a huge fan of our former president.
Yeah.
But you know, those doors that were opened minimally, because obviously they were, I mean, the way that it was done. But what is the significance of Israel getting relations with, you know, 4 or 5, Bahrain and several others?
Yeah, I mean, I think the significance is, I mean, first and foremost, even though these Gulf states are Arab states, these are not Arab states that, you know, historically, I mean, if you think back to that first Arab-Israeli war in 1948 and then the subsequent wars, these are not states that engaged in the wars with Israel, right? I mean, it was Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon. And so, I mean, I think those Gulf states, and I mean, they have, I mean, as they've emerged as financial powers, have been very savvy in terms of positioning themselves in terms of global trade and finance. And so they have not historically been the champions of the Palestinians and have been using the Palestinians as kind of a token. In the ways that, you know, Syria has and Egypt had and Iraq had. So they are, I mean, they are acting very, very pragmatically. And I think their decisions will ultimately force the Palestinians and the Palestinian leadership to kind of recalculate how they continue, because arguably these Gulf states are emerging as major, certainly major financial powers, more so than, you know, the petrol states like Iraq had been, or even Iran. So what happens for the Palestinians then? I mean, I don't want to guess, but I think how Hamas, how Fatah, how they respond will be very interesting to see. And it'll be very interesting to see how, especially Netanyahu, weathers the scandals surrounding him, and how Likud moves forward. Certainly, they are in a very strong position, and they've been bolstered by these shifts. So that's one thing. Certainly, how the Assad government holds on in Syria will be very interesting. Right now, it looks like they will survive this civil war, but they're not loved. So that's.
And will there be any repercussions amongst other Arab states that have not normalized, I use that term loosely, relations with Israel, with those who have? Or are they too financially powerful that they'll let them slide?
I think it's probably the latter. I don't think Israel really cares what Syria does. You know, the Assad government is weak. Syria is economically irrelevant. Whereas, you know, the United Arab Emirates, although they're not, you know, militarily a power, are financially a significant power. So, so I think there's been kind of a gravitational shift among the Arab states, away from those traditional powers. When you think back to the Cold War, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, you know, to the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, we had a representative from the Israeli government on a couple of weeks ago.
Okay.
Talking about their response to the pandemic and their tremendous success with vaccinations.
Yes, for Israelis.
For Israelis. Well, that was the point of contention.
Yes.
We talked quite a bit about the lack of vaccinations for Palestinians, I'll suffice to say that part of the conversation did not go very well.
I can
But
imagine.
I've just read in the last day or two that in fact the Israelis are expanding their vaccination policy to Palestinians, and they are beginning to vaccinate them as well. So maybe that conversation had an impact all the way in Tel Aviv.
Well, it's the optics are not great.
Well, you know, the question we asked, and they really had no answer for this, is, isn't it in Israel's best interest to get Palestinians vaccinated? They live right next door, they interact with it. And, you know,
Right.
there was really no good answer for that, other than they want to do their own thing, we can't make them, which is mostly baloney.
Right.
That's only part of the reason it didn't go well. But it was inevitable in my mind that ultimately the vaccinations would go to Palestinians, because that's the way to get ahead of the diseases, to help your neighbors and that stuff. It's, you know, people in Illinois aren't crazy that Texas is opening up,
Right.
because we're going to get sick from that. It's the same damn thing.
Right.
Don, tell me about this this documentary and the question you want to ask.
Yeah, today in Al Jazeera English, they had on People and Power, 26-minute documentary, Lebanon, a state in collapse. And they talk about it already being in crisis before the blast. And so what kind of recovery is possible. So it's a pretty good documentary. Most of theirs are.
Yeah.
I didn't know if you'd seen it or not.
I had not, but I mean, I feel like the outlook for Lebanon is unfortunately pretty bleak. I mean, certainly the wave of refugees coming from Syria has changed, has put tremendous pressure on, you know, what had once been the Paris of the Middle East. Again, Lebanon, you know, its entire system of government is predicated on sectarian identity, and so any of those kind of demographic shifts, as you know, you have this influx of Muslims, primarily, you know, fleeing Syria, that potentially has devastating effect on the balance of power in Lebanon.
Is Lebanon a failed state?
It's getting close. I hesitate to call it a failed state quite yet. It certainly has gone through other periods where it certainly looked like it was a failed state.
Perhaps, you know, perhaps a failing state.
Yeah. And again, it's such a segmented state, and that power sharing agreement that they set up, you know, under the French, between, you know, Christians and Shiites and Sunnis. You know, whereas it potentially had the means of cooperation, it really just created systems of patronage, which then, you know, created systems of corruption. So, you know, most of the politicians there are just a bunch of Mike Madigans now.
You lived in Chicago long enough, and I grew up there. You know how that works.
Yeah, exactly.
So, you know, my garbage can got picked up. That's all my folks cared
That's
about.
right.
So back to the agreements that Israel has with the UAE and Bahrain, and what do those countries get out of these agreements other than applause from Donald Trump at the moment?
Well, I mean, Israel is the other economic powerhouse of the Middle East. It is arguably the most significant innovator, intellectually, academically, in the Middle East. And so I think those ties are, you know, far more advantageous than, you know, any tie to Syria or Iraq or, you know, even Iran, which is not an Arab state, but, you know, historically had been one of the powers in the Middle East. So, you know, I think there is a desire to be kind of considered amongst the modern states that that they benefit from.
But you certainly wouldn't consider Saudi Arabia a quote modern state.
No, not the least.
And so, you know, does this drive them more out of Saudi's sphere?
Well, and that's a really good point. I hadn't thought of that, but arguably, the UAE and especially Bahrain and Qatar, even more so, have desired to. Because the Saudi Arabia was putting tremendous pressure on Qatar, so that also helps them out. And even Saudi Arabia, has been trying to diversify and modernize their economy and move away from being simply a petrol state as well. So, when you think about it, Israel is probably the most developed economy in terms of, there's not great, there's no oil wealth there, right? There are no resources there.
As smart as the Jews are, they claim the only goddamn sand without oil. How smart is that?
Right. They are, like Taiwan, they have historically invested in human resources, right? In human capital. And as a consequence, they are an innovative, cutting edge state, with amazing technology, amazing companies, And
billions from the US.
Right. And Egypt is getting the same kind of support from the US, but they do not have the same tradition of open inquiry that has led, has made, you could refer to Israel as like the Seattle of the Middle East, right? This is where the innovation's at. This is the innovation hub.
So let me ask this, and it's difficult always to look into the future because we can't predict that. But are these agreements the tip of the spear, and will they expand? And if so, does that change the makeup? Because for 70 years since its founding, Israel was really alone. And you can imagine a scenario where multiple Arab states, including some of the big players, say, well, maybe it's in our best interest to normalize relations and stop this constant war. What do you see about that?
That's entirely possible because, up until recently, Egypt was really the only Arab state that had normalized relationships with Israel. It could very well be that this will begin that shift. And it'll be very interesting to see then, like I said, how the Palestinians opt to respond strategically, because they are no longer a useful. Because let's face it, most Arab states use the Palestinians as a rallying cry without really caring about the Palestinians.
Absolutely.
So
we've got some questions coming in, so let me get to them. The threat of Iran has united Arab world with Israel. Is it likely that will continue?
That's hard to say too, because obviously Iraq, being majority Shiite, is very closely aligned with Iran. Syria, with a Shiite regime in place, even though it's not majority Shiite, is very much aligned with Iran. Iran has very strong links to Lebanon with Hezbollah. I think Iran will continue to use those networks to counter kind of the Sunni Arab led kind of coalition from Saudi Arabia. I'm reluctant to say which side is going to win out.
Before we get off of Lebanon, what's the status of their port facilities? And Janet and Larry asked, the huge explosion, have they rebuilt? Are they trying to do that?
I can't say with certainty. I don't know off the top of my head. The last, in terms of the reports I had, were that things were not progressing apace. But I will say that I don't know.
Okay, Michelle asked about the ramifications behind the Biden's administration, and I was going to ask a question generally about the Biden's administration toward the Middle East, but specifically, she asked about Biden's calling out MBS, however lightly, and what's the ramifications of that? How do the actors in the region view that?
I think it's really interesting that, the day after that, Biden lightly slapped bin Salman on the hand, he did launch those attacks on Iranian-backed militias in Syria. So I think what he was trying to do was, to say that we are disappointed in you, but also remind Saudi Arabia that
We've got your back.
and we are arguably still the most effective force in responding to these Iranian-backed militias, because Saudi Arabia is arguably, they're embroiled in the civil war in Yemen, and with to the detriment of everybody. So,
in your opinion, so I'll put on, you've become a national security advisor.
Yeah, I think we've gone way beyond my pay grade now.
What was Biden's response to MBS? Was that an appropriate, measured thing, or should have been stronger, or not as strong?
In my opinion, it should have been stronger. But
and what would have been the ramifications of that?
Well, I think the ramifications are, the Saudis have changed crown princes on a number of occasions. Trying to keep tabs of, where power is in the royal family is, it's like watching the Kremlin during the Cold War. It's not easy, but, there's no reason to believe that if the US signaled their great displeasure with bin Salman, that there could have at least been an undermining of his clout within the royal family, because there are plenty of other princes.
He seems firmly entrenched.
Yes.
So we've touched on some of the big players in the region, but we haven't touched upon Turkey. And Don raises a good point that, Erdogan wants to recreate or at least spread the vision of the Ottoman Empire. And I suppose the question is, do any of these moving chess pieces on the board help, hinder? If they're ignoring him, does it provide a vacuum? I'm not sure how far, when you say you're a Middle East expert, I'm not sure how far the Middle East goes exactly, but maybe you can answer that.
Well, I think you certainly have to include Turkey. And, even 5 years ago, Erdogan was looking like he was in a much stronger position. I'm not going to say that he's become marginalized, far from it. But there has been, I think, some political discontent expressed within Turkey with Erdogan. And so I do feel like he is working harder to reconsolidate the party's position in Turkey. The Syrian civil war certainly has been something that has embroiled Erdogan. ISIS was presented, potentially interesting challenges for Erdogan. So yeah, I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure where Erdogan goes. And in many ways, we're hearing less about Erdogan right now in the Middle East than we had been, 5-10 years ago.
Well, and certainly he had, if not an ally, a compatriot in the White House under Trump. And
yeah,
if Biden is true about, obviously, I'm sure he will be more of a human rights advocate than Trump, because so would my cat. But certainly that can't help him, I would think. I would put a kind of pressure on him.
Yeah. I haven't given a lot of thought to Erdogan, so I'd be very curious to see what happens going forward.
So Don says Turkey enforces they back control part of Aleppo and the Syrian oil facilities near Aleppo, apparently hit by a Russian missile barrage. I'm not familiar with that, Don.
That's another one reported today
Oh,
by Al Jazeera English. So it just happened not too long ago. And the thoughts are the White Hats and other groups are reporting it was Russia and believed to be a message by Assad and Russia to Erdogan and Turkey and their forces they're backing there to back off.
Do you know, Don or John, about Turkey's economic situation? Is it weakened or?
it's weakened. I mean, it's certainly, I mean, back in 2010, it was seen as an emerging, I mean, it was in a much stronger position. It has weakened since, leading to greater discontent.
Internal discontent.
Yes.
And so I think what you're suggesting is Erdogan is focused more on making sure the guys don't get out to get him as opposed to outside his borders.
To a certain degree, yeah. But as Don's point about Syria and Russia, that also is relevant.
So let me go back to the Pope for a moment.
Yeah, let's get back to the Pope.
Okay. So there's a question whether the interfaith dialogue is more than just a gesture for resolving issues in the region, or if it has lasting significance.
I hope it's
an easy question.
I hope it's more than a gesture. And I mean, I think for a lot of Iraqis, especially a lot of more secular Iraqis, and I am in contact on Facebook and whatnot with other Iraqi scholars who work in my field. There is a desire for a return to that more secular Iraqi state. As horrible as Saddam Hussein was, there was at least a greater possibility for secularism. I mean, that said, Saddam Hussein obviously, was anti-Iranian and anti-Shiite, certainly persecuted the Kurds. But yeah, a lot of the coverage has focused on the desire to revive some of that secularism, in part because, and again, going back to Saddam Hussein, there was that, going back even to the creation of Iraq as a state, there was that desire to find an Iraqi identity that would unify the various ethnicities and religious sects that make up Iraq.
And so I would guess, I think with some confidence, that Iraq has probably been the state in the world that has had the most upheaval for the last 10 or 20 years. It's been a mess.
Oh, yeah.
And so today, is it in a better place? Is it approaching some stability?
I think it is. I mean, certainly ISIS reminds us how quickly it can slide back, because that was, in many regards, unanticipated. I mean, the Obama administration had effectively pulled out of Iraq. I mean, there was still an American presence, but had really drawn down. And ISIS's rise really kind of reflected the Sunni Arab discontent, those northwestern tribes. And if you looked at a map, the territory that ISIS held was Arab and it was Sunni. Those tribes, if you were thinking in terms of kind of a 19th century sense of nationalism, that made sense as a state, more so than the lines that the British and the French drew, right? But that said, we also saw how ISIS's rise really did spawn a coalition where the Kurds especially protected the Christians and the Yazidis, but the Shiites did too. And I think there's a recognition in Iraq writ large that if the country is going to remain viable, there has to be the ability to bring, even the Sunni Arabs back into the broader fold.
And do its neighbors want to encourage or discourage that?
I think they all want to encourage that. I mean, Syria does not want to see a Sunni Arab state. The Assad government certainly doesn't want to see that happen. I have to imagine that Israel does not want to see that happen because, the majority of Palestinians are Sunni Arabs. So I don't, and even Jordan for that matter, probably would not want to see, some kind of Sunni Arab state emerge, a new caliphate. So I think all of the established states in the Middle East, the last thing they want is the re-emergence of an ISIS type state.
Amen to that. Well, John, it's been great. Thanks good to meet you. I'm sure we'll chat again because if anything we can predict, it will be that the Middle East will be aflame sometime in the future.
Yeah. Well,
Angela, excuse me, go ahead.
I just wanted to conclude. I mean, I think the thing that I appreciated most about the Pope's visit is it really reminded us that, the Middle East, even, the current geopolitical situation, the identities that, underlie those tensions, they go back millennia, not even centuries, but millennia. It's always, and I appreciate that about the Pope's visit, it's always good to be mindful of how deep those identities run.
Sometimes it's good to get beyond that stuff, but
yeah,
we do need to remember our history.
Right.
Well, we need to learn our history first.
Yeah.
And then never forget it. But on behalf of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council, thank you, Dr. Nielsen. This was really interesting. And boy, you can dance all over the Middle East.
Well, yeah, you challenged me. Yeah.
That was impressive. Thank you, Shelley. Some good questions and good.
John, we'll give you one of our famous PAWAC parting gifts.
Okay, what is that?
Yeah, what is that? Thank you.
I'll take it.